So hi everyone and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Paul Adepoju and I'm the community manager of the ICFJ Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum. And the forum has been our response to the pandemic in which we try and strive to empower journalists from across the world with information, resources, and training that they required in order to expand and improve their reporting. And we've been able to cover a lot of issues on different topics. And today is not an exception. Today we'll be looking at a key aspect of global health, and which is on guiding journalists on how to navigate the global health policy landscape. And every important decision as far as global health is concerned, these decisions are made by several respected organizations, including the World Health Organization, the United Nations, and several others. Prior to the pandemic, many journalists did not know what goes on at meetings organized by these organizations and how impactful what they do is. But we've seen global decisions being taken at this meeting, and is going to go a long way for journalists across the world to know how these organizations run, so that when you are looking for a story or trying to do global health policy related stories, you know who to talk to, and you will also have a better understanding of what they do at these organizations. And we have respected journalists and who are quite conversant with the global health landscape. And the first person I'll be introducing is Elaine Fletcher, who is the editor-in-chief of Health Policy Watch. And Elaine is I describe her as a veteran Geneva insider. Elaine, how are you doing today?
Hi, how you doing?
I'm very fine. Thank you for joining us today. We also have the Africa editor of Health Policy Watch, Kerry Cullinan. Kerry, I think it's afternoon over there. Good afternoon.
Hi, Paul. Afternoon.
Yeah, so thank you for joining us today. So before we start the engaging and interactive session, they've prepared a presentation that I would like to go through first. And if you are joining us on the Zoom platform, please use the Q&A option on the Zoom platform for your questions. And if you are watching us live on Facebook live stream, please put your questions below the live video that you are watching right now. I think we'll start this presentation, and Kerry, sorry, Elaine, you can start your aspect of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for having me and Kerry. And I'll just introduce us a little bit from the Health Policy Watch point of view. We're based in Geneva. We're a global health agency publishing daily on dedicated health topics, which has become, as you know, a big issue given the COVID crisis. In this presentation, I'm going to talk a little about the way the WHO works, the World Health Organization. Its headquarters is in Geneva. I'm going to shut the window so that we don't have disturbances. Apologies for that. I'm going to talk about WHO's purpose, its powers and governance, how it's laid out regionally as well as in Geneva. We'll talk a little bit about each WHO region. And then we'll also talk about the Geneva health ecosystem. And after that, Kerry will go on and talk about the UN agencies, other UN agencies, because WHO is not the only one that's dealing with health issues. Kerry, do you want to go to the next? So WHO is what's called a UN specialized agency, but it's not the only one. There's also the Unfpa, UNAIDS, UNDP, and UN Women. However, I'm going to be focusing first on WHO because it's the leading health agency in the UN system. It sets the global standards for a wide variety of health-related issues. Everything from what are the most essential medicines that countries need to keep on hand in order to maintain good quality health services, what are the proper procedures for medical treatments, what vaccines should you be giving to your child or to yourself, as well as standards for safe air, water, chemicals, and even more recently, things like daily sugar consumption as we look into things like healthy diets and physical activity. WHO has 6 regional offices. It's headquartered in Geneva, and it's got 9,000 employees worldwide. Okay, Kerry, do you want to go to the next slide?
Sorry.
I think you skipped, I think you, yeah, so I was going to talk a little bit about, the next slide is the WHO regions. I was going to talk a little bit about the way the WHO is organized. It's divided into 6 regions, and it's interesting the way this works because the regions are not really strictly geographical. And so this can be also confusing for media. And in terms of how you describe the activities and interests of your region, it's good to know these nuances and distinctions. What we see is the kind of what I call an elegant separation of some key political rivals. For instance, the North Korea, DPRK, is part of the Southeast Asia region, where India is a dominant country, while the Republic of Korea is part of the Western Pacific region alongside China and Australia. Israel is part of the European region, while Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan are all core members of the WHO's Eastern Mediterranean Regional Office. And there are a number of North African countries that are members of the Eastern Mediterranean Office, even though they are African countries. So each of these regions has its own quirks. We'll talk a little more about them one by one. But the region of the Americas is kind of an interesting one in particular. It has its own independent history and tradition, and it really functions its own mini WHO. It's called most frequently the Pan-American Health Organization. In fact, it has 2 names. It's called the WHO Regional Office of the Americas and the Pan-American Health Organization, with its own governing board and member assembly. Other regions also have annual meetings of their member states. And these are important moments for people to watch if you're looking at the regional workings of WHO and what kinds of policies are happening in your region. These are moments where a good time to watch for stories, for policy trends, and basically new directions in the future year. Next slide. Also, I wanted to mention, so here I just wanted to give you a visual view of this weird regional distinctions. You can see the Afro region is all in blue. You can see the gold colors of the Eastern Mediterranean. You can see the European region is huge and also includes Russia. And then you see the Western Pacific region includes countries like China and Australia. You see Southeast Asia region, including North Korea up at the top. And then you see the region of the Americas. Okay, next slide. So now I'm just going to give you a little bit of a thumbnail bird's eye view of each region, which perhaps Kerry will develop further, or you can ask questions at the question and answer session. But the WHO African region, which is frequently called WHO Afro, that's its Twitter handle, includes 47 countries. So it's not all 55 of the African Union. I think it's 55 African Union countries. It's a region that's really been the most need and the least funded for many years, although it's boosted by special funding that it gets from the US, from UNICEF and others. I think politically it's interesting to look at how the regional office has become a bit bolder in how it speaks and how it presents itself to the media since the appointment of Matshidiso Moeti, who's the regional director, a very dominant personality in the WHO constellation, as well as in the African office. And in line with, I think, her philosophy, the African region has also been holding regional weekly press briefings on COVID almost since the pandemic began, along with African CDC. They go back to back every week, and Paul covers many of these or most of these for us. Africa CDC, however, in some ways is still seen as setting many of the trends on COVID response. Again, WHO can be a very conservative and publicly shy body in many of its parts. And I think the fact that Africa CDC is out ahead on many issues also then allows the African Regional Office of WHO to move along more aggressively and more assertively than it has in the past. Okay, next slide. The Eastern Mediterranean region is 22 countries. As you can see, this kind of spans a whole band of countries from North Africa all the way as far east as Pakistan. Also, there's a huge preoccupation in this region with health and humanitarian relief, just because there are so many conflict zones. Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Palestinians, Lebanon, these are all big issues for that region. Migrants and refugees. It holds very different kinds of governments, and often governments that are at odds with each other. It's not holding regular COVID briefings. And I think this is often typical. When there's less political solidarity in a region, then you're going to see less public posturing than you will in regions where there's a little more sense of solidarity between the countries themselves, because basically WHO is a member state organization. The next region we'll talk about a little more is PAHO, the region of Americas. As we said, it's got two names because it has its own official identity that actually predates, to some extent, the creation of the WHO. It covers the Caribbean, North, Central, and South America. And it's probably the best financed region, thanks to heavy US funding, but there's also significant US political influence. This was, I think, felt quite a bit during the Trump period. When the Trump policies might often be at odds with those of many other Latin American countries. And this puts a regional office into a kind of position of, I would say, freezing or stagnation, when it cannot take a lot of strong initiatives because its own member states are at odds about how to proceed. At the same time, I think there's a very strong, what I call even Latin American tradition and direction in the PAHO office. And that's been reestablished since the end of the Trump period, when I think PAHO feels again more free to express itself. It's often a region that's a first for rolling out pilot programs in low and middle income countries because it's such a strong office and such a well-funded office. And since the COVID, in line with all this, it's been holding weekly media briefings on Wednesdays, led by the regional director, Carissa Etienne. The Southeast Asia region is a hugely important population. It covers over 25% of the world's people, and many of the growing mega cities in the world, like Delhi. It's deeply it's responding to all the traditional infectious disease issues, but also some risks that are very particular to the Southeast Asia region, like air pollution, which, as we know, is a perennial problem in big cities like Delhi, but not only Delhi, in many other cities of the region, Nepal, Bangladesh, and elsewhere. It's also an interesting position because India is and some of its neighbors, Bangladesh, are world generics powerhouses. India has been a co-sponsor of the IP waiver to waive all sorts of intellectual property associated with COVID medicines, vaccines, and tests, an initiative that's ongoing at the World Trade Organization in Geneva and in parallel with activities at WHO, if you've been following that. The WHO CRO, however, does not have weekly COVID conferences. I think that reflects, again, a certain kind of reticence about putting itself forward in the media. And the regional offices are in Delhi. India, again, is a driving force in that office. Then the Western Pacific region has 37 countries, including really different cultures, income levels. You can see from the list here, 1.9 billion people, a lot of trade and cooperation economically, and yet huge and growing tensions politically in the Western Pacific between China, Japan, Australia, for instance. And this has all been, of course, accentuated greatly by COVID, and particularly by the debate over the origins of the COVID virus, where as Japan and Australia have been pushing very hard on China to be more transparent about data and to consider other options besides the emergence of the virus from natural sources, such as a lab escape. And the Chinese have rejected this outright. and have at times even suggested the virus might have emerged from a US military base or from frozen foods. So we see all this coming together in the fact that there are never media briefings in the WIPRO, what we call the WIPRO office. Although it's important as journalists to be aware that the Chinese state media often has briefings, and these are important to watch, especially right now on the COVID origins issue, where we're waiting to see if there's going to be another, what the second phase of investigations will involve, and if China will open itself up to those investigations, to a new team of international experts, to looking more deeply at some of the data that other countries allege needs to be examined more transparently. Another important subgroup in the Western Pacific region are the Pacific Island states, which are low income, traditionally undeveloped, poorly developed, and dealing with both diseases of the typical diseases of poverty, as well as the most immediate impacts of global warming and sea level rise, where a few of these countries are threatened with extinction, in fact. So WHO has made climate response a big issue in that region. I've got a couple of, you can see a couple of documents that they produced recently. Okay, next slide. In terms of the governance, as we mentioned, WHO is a specialized UN agency, so it has its own member state governing body, including all 194 states that are dues-paying members. And this is called the World Health Assembly. They meet once a year in Geneva, although since COVID, for the first time ever, those meetings have been held virtually. That's been a big psychological shock, I think, for the WHO community, because these meetings were typically at times when countries would get together, rub shoulders, talk face-to-face, informally, and build a lot of bridges, so that, as well as negotiating. And this was important, I think, for the coherence of global health policy. Now all this is being done remotely, and it's much more difficult to break deadlocks, to mediate between disputes when you've got that, when you don't have that human person-to-person connection. The WHO Executive Board is the smaller body of 34 member states coming from all 6 WHO regions, which meets twice a year, and they guide WHO policies throughout the year. So they're supposed to keep a closer hand on WHO and what's going on, although they've been accused during the COVID crisis of not keeping track closely enough. And there's been a lot of criticism internally and also in the media about the executive board not fulfilling the role that it should in the pandemic. Next slide. Just to kind of wrap up the WHO part of this discussion, we can talk about the limitations of both the World Health Assembly and the WHO, which is the secretariat, as it were. First of all, the WHO is highly dependent on member state contributions, and it has had regular assessed fees to each country. However, these have been declining as a proportion of the WHO budget for over a decade. And WHO has been increasingly dependent on voluntary donor contributions from high-income countries mostly. And this also makes it very dependent on the whims and policy interests of the donor countries themselves. And Tedros, the new WHO, well, he's not so new anymore. He's been in DG since 2017, but then the WHO's Director General, Tedros, has talked a lot about the need for reforming WHO's finance, and there are moves afoot now to increase the regular country assessed fees in order to try to overcome some of these issues, but we'll see how well that plays out in coming months. That's an important issue, though, because at the moment WHO is often prisoner of what we call donor-driven interests and donor-driven initiatives. And this makes it more difficult for it to systematically set long-term directions. There's also a perennial criticism about the disconnect between the WHO's work and the headquarters and regions. WHO headquarters offices contain a lot of young consultants hired at short term from Europe often, and often don't have experience in regions and experience on the ground. And a lot of the WHO develops a lot of guidance documents, a lot of paper that often may not be relevant to what regions really need and what country offices in WHO really need for help. And the country offices in WHO, particularly in the African region, but also elsewhere, are desperately short of person power to carry out basic functions like supporting water and sanitation programs or immunization programs. And this disconnect, I think, is something that Tedros has also tried to address, but I'm not sure, honestly, how successful he has been. The other issues that come up often in the WHO constellation are, where is it leaning? Where is the Director General leaning in terms of his politics? And as we know, during the COVID period, we've had increasing tension between China and Western countries. And during the Trump period, when the US was in the process of withdrawing from WHO, Tedros was perceived as more China-leaning, actually. And now, as the US has stepped back into the picture of WHO much more assertively, he's being seen as much more pro-Western, I would say. So he's treading a delicate balance. He's always trying to create a message of solidarity, of global solidarity, but in truth, behind the scenes, he's also beholden politically to all the forces that elected him, all the member states that elected him. The other really big weakness of the World Health Assembly is that its resolutions are in fact non-binding on member states, with the exception of what are called the international health regulations, which are binding, and those govern response to emergencies. But as we've seen during the COVID pandemic, those responses, even though they're supposed to be binding, are still very weak. And WHO still lacks real independent powers to investigate outbreaks, such as the origins of the virus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus in Wuhan, China, or elsewhere. And one solution that's being tossed about now or being proposed at the last World Health Assembly in May, and will be taken up again this fall, is the possibility of a new pandemic treaty, which would be a higher level binding agreement between member countries, which would give WHO enhanced powers to go in early on to an outbreak response and to check what's going on and see how so that WHO can be more on the ground, faster on the ground, and more effective in blunting the risk that associated with pandemic spread. Okay, next slide, please. There's also a huge health hub that's developed around WHO, which I'm not going to get into in great detail. But as you know, the Gates Foundation has become a big driver in global health over the past 2 decades. And the 2 key institutions that are funded by the Gates Foundation, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and the Global Fund, which is dedicated to fighting HIV, AIDS, TB, and malaria, are housed in Geneva. There's also a big biotech hub. There's a number of major universities active in Geneva, and there's a whole constellation of smaller but very well-known NGOs, such as Medicines for Malaria Venture, or DNDi, which deals with neglected diseases. And these are important hothouses for policies, directions, and also new medications that can then be taken up by the bigger players. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Kerry to continue. Thank you, Kerry.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Elaine. I'm going to whip through the United Nations, which is pretty overwhelming, and just try to pinpoint important bodies to follow. So the United Nations, there are 193 member states, and mostly the General Assembly is the main policy-making body, and it has sessions from September to December, although with COVID it started to meet virtually. And the next session starts on the 14th of September. Sometimes the United Nations General Assembly has special sessions which focus on health issues. And it has high-level meetings. It's had a couple on HIV and on COVID. It's had on non-communicable diseases. And then it has summits as well. There's a food summit coming up, tentatively dated 13th of September, and that has implications both for farming and for eating and food policy. But mostly for the purposes of health, it's the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that the different agencies are focusing on. And that's just a quick picture of the goals. You can see number 3 is good health and well-being, but many of these, like gender equality, etc., they have a health component in them. Each of those goals is subdivided into a number of different deliverables, and the different UN agencies are responsible for their promotion, implementation, and monitoring of these. So, for example, UN Women looks at gender equality. UNDP is the leading agency on LGBTIQ inclusion. And there's 72 countries in the world that still criminalize same-sex relationships. So that's quite a big and contentious one. There's also UNFPA. I think I might have left one off. There we go. UNFPA, which looks at sexual and reproductive health, and UNAIDS looking at HIV. UNAIDS and UNFPA are both facing quite substantial funding cuts, and there has been talk on and off about UNAIDS being phased out because why should one disease have its own agency? So that it's quite in flux. But UNFPA has also differed. The UK International Aid Agency has slashed its aid to UNFPA, which is going to have quite serious implications. So they like the WHO, they're really dependent on member states' voluntary contributions. There's quite a major battleground in the UN over sexual and reproductive health and LGBTIQ issues in UN forums. This is driven by NGOs and the Holy See that have observer status at the UN. And they lobby member states, and there's an alliance with Russia, the Arab states, Hungary, Brazil, and a number of African countries. The US was quite key in this under Trump, but obviously things have started to change now. But there is still this fairly solid alliance, and some of these NGOs are really right-wing, and they've had member status since the 1990s, and more of them, that is their agenda, is to get this observer status. So the big the areas of kind of contention are abortion, sometimes also contraception, because Catholics by the Holy See are against contraception. There's a whole fight around what is called key populations with regard to HIV, which is particularly injecting drug users, sex workers, and men who have sex with men. So there's a huge fight around that, and also around comprehensive sexuality education, which is sex education for kids. But because the UN developed curriculum mentions gender diversity and even just simply mentions that there are LGBTIQ people in the world, that has become also a huge battleground. I just wanted to give you an example here. There was recently a high-level meeting on HIV, and this is the writing at the bottom is the interpreter. But the Russian Federation was opposed to anything that would repeal states having being able to prosecute people for their HIV status, and also for to decriminalize injecting drug use. And the UN, the US was countering this, saying that key populations and populations left behind and gender inequality are addressing those are key for ending HIV. So you would think that a declaration on HIV was relatively straightforward, but there are all these undercurrents that play themselves out in these UN forums. sorry, my button is sticky. So just in conclusion, there are lots of contentious and interesting health issues being discussed in these global forums. But often the conflict and the tension is obscured by the technical jargon. So you need to just learn how to read between the lines. And there are lots and lots of NGOs and academics that follow these various bodies. And the best advice would be to ask them for help, because it's really hard on your own to try and figure these out. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Elaine, and thank you very much, Kerry, for these insights that you provided. And I remember when I first attended covered my first World Health Assembly, I began to ask myself, how can this, it seems quite boring. One person will come, start reading a prepared remark, and nothing. Everybody will just read their statement and go. And in spite of how boring they seem, do you think the current system works? And what do you think can still be done to improve the efficiency of this particular structure that we have? At least that is what the world has presently. So let's start with Elaine. So what do you think is your personal assessment of the current structure on ground?
Oh, it's such a big question, because you talk about, I mean, a couple of things come to mind. One is that in terms of the World Health Assembly, yes, you're right, the meetings can be really boring, and then you'll have these electric moments. It's a really diplomatic process, but it's sometimes a lot more polite, I'd say almost reticent, than what you'll see at the United Nations, at the GA. So you really do have to be patient and rely on other observers, academics, and people that are following it to give you inside view and tips of what to cover. In terms of what could be done to make things better, two things come to mind for me. One is in terms of there's been a lot of talk in WHO for the last 10 years, 15 years. I worked at WHO for many years. And there was talk when I first arrived there in 2003 about 75% of the money going to regions and 25% going to headquarters. I think that, and Tedros has tried to push this sort of regional country-led focus. But I think, unfortunately, there's still the weight of the resources still often is too much heavily pointed towards Geneva. And we really need more technical people and more support in some key regions that lack that today. I think that the regions, the country offices of WHO not only has 6 regional offices, I forgot to mention they have over 90 country offices. The country offices are the ones talking most directly to the ministries of health, whispering into their ears, and really helping to guide them. And the country offices are often most lacking in support, brains, not ability, resources and also perhaps empowerment to move agendas. So I would still be pushing more aggressively to shift money to the countries. And then, as we discussed the WHA, the World Health Assembly, I do think having more assessed contributions from member states. I need to shut my, I'm getting things from Bill Gates, as you can see. I guess my screen's not showing up.
Just ignore the pop-ups.
I think, yeah, I just realized my pop-ups aren't showing up on the screen, so it's okay. But I wanted to turn off my Outlook. But I think if we had more stable assessed contributions, so especially the big rich countries are giving money, not voluntarily saying, I want to earmark it for this or earmark it for that, but just giving a blanket assessed contributions, then WHO would have a bigger budget and ability to move ahead more confidently. So, yeah.
And then Kerry, something happened in Africa. I think the Tanzania dilemma around COVID actually showed the limitations, or let me say how powerless many of these major international organizations are. We had a case where a country decided not to share case figures with the rest of the world, and nothing happened from that. How much damage do you think that kind of powerlessness does to global health?
I think that it undermines the authority of the WHO and other organizations. If particularly, as Elaine said, the policies that they adopt are voluntary. And so, as you say, the Tanzanian president decided that there was no such thing as COVID. And he had said a whole lot of controversial things before he died. And even today, we are still waiting for the figures from Tanzania on COVID. There's no, he said there's no such thing as COVID. So even people who traveled to Zanzibar, etc., for holidays, they would have to go through the process of getting a COVID test, but there was no such thing as a negative COVID test. So people would just pay $50 and they would just be given this thing. So it was completely fake and crazy. And it certainly didn't help around the borders with Tanzanian drivers driving in and out of Uganda and so on. It didn't help. They were exporting COVID, but they were not even allowed to say. So I think the November discussion on a pandemic treaty and whether there'll be binding regulations related to that in a crisis will help us. Also because of the distribution of vaccines, which, as we know, you and I, Paul, it's been totally unfair, because the Pfizers and Modernas have sold their vaccines to the rich countries, whereas our countries have had to stand in line. So if there is a declaration that during a pandemic, something like a vaccine is a global good and it has to be fairly distributed, that would go a long way to restoring faith. But at the moment, it just seems like, as always, the rich countries dominate and the rest of us have to stand in line.
Okay, as well, Elaine, don't you think there is still, or let me know whether this exists, there ought to be a major organization that everybody listens to, whether you like it or not. Everybody obeys, everybody abides with that instruction. If that is the case, we can be able to be rest assured that global health priorities will be well prioritized, and no nation is going to do something that will be counterproductive to the global health in general. And that we'll be able to be rest assured that when we need answers to some questions like the world still has for China, there will be no reluctance or restrictions anyway. Does that still exist? Does that exist in any form? And is it possible in our lifetime for the WHO or any organization to be empowered that much? Or what is the biggest threat to having something that is that powerful?
Paul, it reminds me of the John Lennon song, Imagine, because really, if we could do that for global health, we could also do it for war and peace. If we'd have one global government like the UN, and we'd be eradicating poverty and stopping wars, because everybody would listen to that global government. As we know, we're very far from that reality. Perhaps we have a bigger chance of getting to consensus around health and climate change, because governments are slowly waking up to the fact of how interconnected we are. And at the same time, even though they are waking up, as we've seen from the whole vaccine distribution story, there's not enough awareness to really drive a global approach to vaccine distribution. So it's just a long, and I'm thinking of another Beatles song now, a long and stony road or something, a long and winding road to get to something different. I think the fact the US has gotten back into the picture in a much more collaborative way helps a lot. I think that we see regions of the world like Europe, which were at war with each other and massacring each other 50 years ago, which are cooperating politically. And so I think the more we have regional cooperation, we see like the AU and Africa CDC coming out now and cooperating more. More we have that kind of regional cooperation occurring between member states, breaking down boundaries of trade. agreeing, that we're dealing with the African Medicines Agency, creation of an African Medicines Agency for a single sort of unit for approval of medicines in Africa. The more we have that kind of cooperation between countries and regions, I think we can get to the global level. So I would urge reporters also that are covering these kinds of stories to be looking at what level are your neighboring countries cooperating. And at Health Policy Watch, I often say, to make the leap between the country and to the global, you need to have that regional linchpin. So when people propose stories to us, our correspondents in countries, I'll often say, well, what's the regional picture? What's really going on in East Africa? Not just Kenya, but East Africa, or not just Nigeria, West Africa, or Southern Africa. And when we do that, we start to we step back a little further and we start looking more broadly at what's going on. And our critical role also helps push ahead that kind of cooperation.
Elaine, I would have loved you to take a cup of water too, but this question is directly for you from Toby McIntosh. So Toby, WHO has a freedom of information policy. What has been your experience with using it?
Well, I worked inside WHO, so look, I think WHO has done much better. I'll be diplomatic. I think WHO has done much better at like the WJ at putting across its messages and trying to respond to media. And the fact that it's having these global weekly or sometimes bi-weekly press conferences that everyone can zoom into is fantastic. And they take questions, open questions from the podium, and they answer them on the spot. So if you can get your question in, and we've occasionally managed to get in, you can get your embarrassing question in, they're going to have to answer it, okay? At the same time, I think communications in WHO is still very tightly controlled at times. And WHO doesn't, like any big institution, is very protective of its own turf. It's very risk averse. It's got a very strong corporate ethic on the inside that everybody adheres to. So people will avoid internal criticism. They'll avoid washing out the dirty laundry. And at times, okay, this is really understandable. At other times, we need positive, legitimate criticism to move the organization ahead. So I'd say it's a mixed bag.
Yeah, it is. It is. Kerry, let's start this question with you because you cover you're the Africa editor. And the WHO recently had itself struggling to deal with vast sexual abuse controversy. And so let's start with this. This is a very, very, it was a very, very serious allegation, and I don't think the organization has been able to really wash its hands off it easily. And this has to do with its engagement of people at the grassroots, that the leadership of the organization may not even have full control over many aspects of this. So issues like these leave international organizations vulnerable, and especially in regions of Africa where people are also vulnerable. It's a really, really serious bad press and serious allegation for the organization to be doing. So what do you think, what is the assessment of sexual abuse in the context of global health organizations, and what do you think is this something that they can convincingly deal with?
I think it's a huge problem throughout. When the UN sends its so-called peacekeepers into countries, there's a lot of allegations of rape from those, and it goes right through from that to Me Too campaigning within UN agencies as well. So it's a massive topic. I think the World Health Assembly recently did look at a report on the allegations. I think you even covered it, Paul. And there are going to be consequences for those who have been involved in sexual abuse. So there's a process that's going on, but it's long and it's slow. And that is the problem, is that often justice is very slow, and then people do not see that justice is coming, and then they feel aggrieved. As far as the sort of internal sex abuse cases have gone on, a few years ago, there was quite a strong allegations of sexual abuse and harassment within UNAIDS that had been covered up apparently by the person who was the perpetrator just got a slap on the wrist. There was huge pushback on that, and the head of UNAIDS actually had to leave. So internally, there seems to be more action happening, but I think that there's still a massive problem with the activities and the conduct of UN people in different countries. And I think that if that's not addressed in a serious way, certainly people in poorer countries who are always taken advantage of are not going to welcome international agencies. But I saw that one of the question related to this is about sexual abuse of journalists. And the only thing that I can, and particularly in Uganda, so there are always national organizations representing journalists, and I think that possibly they should be pressurized to act in these cases. I think in Uganda there's quite an active women's and feminist movements and organizations. So if the person wanted to get hold of me offline and I can connect them up, if there was a problem with that, maybe they could get hold of you, Paul, and I can connect them up with people in Uganda who could possibly help them. I think possibly that would be the best way. If there's a very particular case involving a specific journalist, I can do that offline.
Yeah, thank you very much. So Elaine, I will still go back. Why do you think getting justice for sexual abuse is slow at global health organizations? I think is a very serious issue, and these organizations seem quite unable to quickly accelerate the justice process.
Well, I think there's two problems, two ends to the stick. One is still the protection of powerful people who may be implicated or who have cast a blind eye themselves. Yes. We've seen this, and in the case of some allegations to the WHO. And this goes back to the question about holding global health agencies accountable and the democracy of the agency, that there's really got to be a strong internal justice system. And WHO has been accused recently of not having a strong system. The internal justice system is basically controlled by the Director General. And however well-meaning that person may be, it still you still wind up concentrating, when you talk about a sort of more democratic approach, the judicial section should be separate from the administration. Instead, we've got the judicial owned by the administration. So there's no separation of powers. And if somebody's accused of misdeeds, the process can take a very long time to appeal. And they're often not people are often not also, in some cases, people are wrongly accused. People can also be wrongly accused of abuses. They can lose their jobs before they have had the right to appeal. So the whole internal justice system really needs to be renovated at the top. At the field level, I know from talking to sources in Congo, I had spoken to one UN official who was in charge of the sexual abuse sensitization. I don't know I can't remember the correct term, but the training, capacity building, the whole and setting up of the enforcement mechanisms at ground level. And she said that this was for a major UN agency, and she described it as a real joke. This going back several years ago. I mean, that was her very blunt language. She basically poured out her heart to me for about a half hour about this job that she'd held and how she felt that nobody took it seriously. She was trying to set up trainings. She was trying to go around to field offices of different UN agencies, not just WHO. And she said it was all just regarded as something you kind of had to check the box on, but not really carry through on. So the kind of media exposure we've seen recently to this issue, hopefully will force the agencies from the top down to take a much more serious approach. But it has to come with also a willingness to have a strong internal justice system in these agencies, as well as a strong field presence of capacity and enforcement.
Yeah, so let me come back to you, Kerry, and look at what is the advice that you're going to give journalists that are interested in covering these organizations, activities of these organizations within where they live? Where do you think they should go to? Where should they turn to for information?
I think if you want to cover the WHO globally, as Elaine said, those weekly and sometimes bi-weekly WHO media briefings are really useful. So get yourself, it's very easy, you just register, get yourself onto the media list at WHO, and then you get notifications, and then you can join their weekly sessions. And then it depends on which region you're based in, but I think you should also sign up to the briefings from the different regions or from in your region, and then try to reach out to the media people there and get yourself known, and so that they send you things and then they respond to your questions and so on. Obviously for them, they want to know that they're not wasting their time. So you do need to publish stories once you've asked them the questions. Otherwise, they won't carry on responding to you. So make sure that you do have an outlet for your stories. You're not just asking stories. I'm asking questions and then wasting their time. But I think start with that, and then once you become known that you cover this, then people send you information. And Twitter is a great source of information. People often make comments on, if you post your stories on Twitter, and then people engage, and then you see who they are. And you also search Twitter. I use advanced search on Twitter a lot to find comments on particular issues. And you find extraordinary things, people that you wouldn't necessarily have contacted. So Twitter's quite a big sort of opening up, giving you ideas about who sources are on particular issues.
Yeah, so for Elaine, I'd like to know when we have big conferences, like for instance, the UN General Assembly, the Food Summit, and quite other UN linked important events, that there are multiple sessions happening, sometimes concurrently. What is your advice for journalists that want to be covering these major events?
Well, if you're just one person, then you probably need to zoom in on a couple of themes and try and cover. What I always say is look thematically at what they're saying. Don't just, if the issue, I'm trying to think of, well, we talked about the sexual abuse scandals at WHO. We covered the discussions on those, but I really tried to focus some of the work we did on the internal justice system to zoom in on that. So don't just take what was said at the meeting, take that as the starting point, and then talk to other independent sources, because how they interpret what was said at the meeting is going to be more important than what was really said, in fact. Keep in mind that the global health world is not a world of as brutal diplomacy as the other parts of the UN. We're not, the war and peace issues are presented in much clearer terms in a way. They're expounded upon a lot more in the media. Global health is still a lot more inside baseball, and yet it's so important. So you've got to talk to those independent voices and get their view on what's coming up that you should really watch for, and then you pay attention to those sessions. Then if something really hot comes out of the session, do it as a breaking story right away. But if not, you can also take a day, step back, talk to a few other people, and take a day later to write about that same session from what I call a more thematic point of view. And but it's not easy, and I think it's incredible training in diplomacy to tease out some of these tensions and these issues, such as the ones Kerry discussed about the human reproduction, the Russian, the debates that were going on about the resolution there. So it's a challenge and a learning curve to cover these types of events.
Kerry, do you also have any advice to add?
No, the main thing though is make connections. I think, if you can find out if you're covering a topic, and then you just search and find out who the key people are and then introduce yourself. A lot of people are very keen to help journalists and to explain things and stuff. So that would be my advice, is just try and reach out to as many people as you can, and somebody's going to help you.
Maybe just one other thing.
Okay, yeah.
I'll add. So I would say that also when you have these big events, you have the keynotes. So always pay attention, always listen to keynotes. Those are good breaking stories that you can cover right away. Those are easy hits. But listen to the keywords, listen to the code language that's being said, because that's where you're going to hear the change and the nuance, and then go from there to the deeper dive a day or two later.
Yeah, do you think these are the declarations, the pronunciation, the pronouncements at these meetings, like we said, they are usually not binding on any country, but we still have countries trying to pick and edit each word the way each phrase is inserted into the declaration, even though it's still non-binding. What role do you think the journalists, do you think the journalists are understand how to really cover these organizations, or do you think there is anything that the journalists can do to help bring attention to some of the ridiculous things that are happening at these meetings? Anybody? Let's start with Kerry.
Are you asking how journalists can highlight some of the tensions and conflict? Is that what you're asking? Oh.
Kerry, I think you did that.
Yes. Do you think journalists are helping in any way that are not?
Sorry, Paul,
did you get that?
I didn't get that. You froze for a moment.
Okay, my question is that do you think these issues are continuing because journalists are not calling attention to them?
I don't think they're continuing because journalists are not drawing attention to them. It's not journalists' fault. They're ongoing because they're never resolved. It's a human condition that seems to have conflict over all sorts of things stemming from people's different beliefs. I mean, I was trying to show you at the UN, there's this huge polarization now between the people who say that they're for family values, but they define family in very, very narrow terms, and then other people who are trying to extend human rights to everybody. So that's a fundamental kind of divide, and it's not made by journalists, it's made by different ideological beliefs.
But I think the HIV conference that you mentioned, Kerry, that you covered was an example of how you were able to flesh out that kind of debate and show how possibly petty it can also be at times in the way you reported on it, because you pulled out and zoomed in into the huge debate that was going on over a resolution that sought to address genuine risks of HIV in certain populations, and yet there was such a resistance. So maybe you can describe what was going through your mind when you did that to stimulate, more attention to those kinds of issues.
I think Paul will have to guide me, because I think we've got 1 more minute left, whether I should answer that or not.
Yeah, you can quickly answer it. So I will.
I think I was lucky because I had a background in covering these right-wing organizations from a previous work at Open Democracy. So I was attuned to that, but maybe other people would not be, but there is a very fundamental battle, and I don't think it's petty, I think it's fundamental, that's playing itself out between those who want human rights for everybody and those who want a traditional society where women stay in the kitchen, have very few rights, and men are in charge. And that there's no such thing as LGBTIQ people. It's a fundamental conflict, which which we need to be aware of when we cover these events.
Yeah, so I think we are right on time, and I would have loved to drag this on. I think very concise and direct conversation. As far as global health is concerned, this continue to be relevant and to be where, even though they are in this conversation, that they are not perfect, everything is, but at least they are the ones insights and guidance for the time being. And very important for journalists in different parts of the world what these organizations are doing locally. Such story, when you are working on a story and you want to have perspective, international organization view, able to reach out. From personal experience, like to them to be aware of you, they need to know so that you can be able to really to help you. I was about wrapping up. I think this question came in for at the last time. Let me quickly get it. Hi, Kerry. As Africa editor for HPW, a great story pitch. Oh, very good, very good. That person should send an email to Kerry. So thank you today. And I really want to appreciate Elaine time out of their very busy schedule, scheduling to attend these. If you are information about the International Center for Journalists, please .icfj.org. There's information for if you would like information regarding tools that you as a journalist, www.ignet.org, join the ICFJ Global Health Crisis Report community on Facebook, and you go to Facebook and search for Crisis Reporting Forum. Interactions and can actively materials and insights with other issues. From me and everyone, thank you very much today, and we'll see some other time specifically. So take care. Thank you, Elaine. And Stella, from the 5, 4, 3. Bye.